Some nations are negotiated into existence. But America was not. It arrived with thunder, loud, unstoppable, and echoing through every corner of the colonies. Before America became the United States, the 13 colonies existed as part of the powerful British Empire. For generations, many colonists saw themselves as British citizens living in a distant part of the empire. They shared language, traditions, and economic ties with Britain, but by the middle of the 18th century, a growing divide began forming between the colonies and the government across the Atlantic. After the French and Indian War, Britain attempted to recover its financial losses by increasing control and taxation over the colonies. Measures like the Stamp Act, Townshend Acts, and Tea Act created anger among many colonists who believed they were being governed without proper representation. The conflict was not immediately about independence. At first, many wanted their rights restored as British subjects. However, as British soldiers arrived in greater numbers and began occupying colonial cities, especially Boston, the relationship between the empire and its people began to collapse. The sight of red-coated soldiers walking through colonial streets became a constant reminder of British authority, and to many patriots, those soldiers represented oppression rather than protection. Boston became the center of revolutionary tension because it was a city where the struggle between Britain and the colonies could be seen every day. Following events like the Boston Massacre in 1770 and the Boston Tea Party in 1773, the British government responded by tightening its control over Massachusetts. Troops were sent into Boston to enforce British laws and maintain order, but their presence only increased resentment. Imagine living in a city where foreign soldiers patrolled the streets, where disagreements between civilians and troops happened regularly, and where every conversation in a tavern or marketplace could become political. The people of Boston were divided. Some believed the colonies needed to remain loyal to the crown, fearing that rebellion would bring chaos and destruction. Others believed Britain had gone too far and that resistance was necessary. These loyalists and patriots lived side by side, sometimes as neighbors and even family members, but the question of loyalty created deep divisions. The American Revolution was not simply Americans fighting Britain, it was also a struggle among colonists themselves over what their future should become. As the tension increased, the conflict moved beyond protests and political arguments into a hidden war of information. Intelligence became one of the most valuable weapons of the revolution. The people living through the revolution experienced a world filled with uncertainty and sacrifice. Colonial citizens were not simply watching history happen, they were forced to make choices that could determine their future. Farmers left their fields to fight in militias. Merchants risked their businesses by supporting resistance. Women managed homes, farms, and family responsibilities while many men were away fighting. Enslaved and free black people faced complicated realities as a war centered around liberty unfolded while slavery continued in many parts of America. Native nations also faced difficult decisions as they attempted to protect their lands and communities during a conflict between two powerful sides. Before armies marched, spies gathered information, messengers carried warnings, and ordinary people risked their lives to influence the outcome of events. George Washington understood that a military force could not defeat the British without knowing their plans and movements. Throughout the colonies, people became involved in secret communication networks. Farmers, merchants, craftsmen, and local leaders collected information about British activity and passed it along to Patriot commanders. The spy world of the Revolution was filled with uncertainty because discovery could lead to imprisonment or death. The famous Culper Ring, which operated later during the war around British-occupied New York, showed how important intelligence became. These spies were not always trained soldiers or famous heroes. Many were regular citizens who believed that information could be just as powerful as a weapon on the battlefield. One of the most famous figures connected to this world of communication and resistance was Paul Revere. Although his midnight ride became legendary, the real story of Revere reveals a much deeper role in the revolutionary movement. Revere was a Boston silversmith, political activist, and member of the Patriot cause. He helped spread revolutionary ideas and used his skills as an engraver to create images and messages that influenced public opinion against British policies. On the night of April 18, 1775, Patriot leaders learned that British troops were moving toward Lexington and Concord. The British objective was to capture important Patriot leaders such as Samuel Adams and John Hancock and destroy colonial military supplies. Revere, along with William Dawes and Samuel Prescott, rode through the countryside warning communities that British forces were approaching. The famous story of lanterns displayed in the Old North Church became a symbol of that night, but the real importance was the warning itself. The colonial militia had time to prepare because information traveled faster than the British expected. This communication helped lead directly to the battles of Lexington and Concord, the opening battles of the American Revolutionary War. This single act branded Paul Revere as one of the most recognizable figures of the American Revolution because of the legendary midnight ride that warned the colonies that British forces were moving toward Lexington and Concord. His mission was urgent: alert the colonial militia that the enemy was approaching. Although the famous phrase "the Redcoats are coming" is a later retelling rather than the exact words historians believe were shouted, the meaning behind it was powerful and instantly understood. The term Redcoats referred to the British soldiers because of their distinctive red military uniforms, which had become one of the most recognizable symbols of the British Empire's power. To the colonists, hearing that the Redcoats were coming meant more than simply soldiers approaching. It meant the arrival of the king's authority, the force that had occupied their streets, enforced British laws, and challenged their belief in self-government. The red uniform represented one of the most disciplined and experienced armies in the world, but to many patriots it also represented control and oppression. Revere's ride became a symbol of resistance because it showed that ordinary citizens could stand against a powerful empire through courage, communication, and determination. That night, the warning spread from town to town, awakening farmers and militia members who prepared to face the British advance. By morning, the confrontation at Lexington and Concord would begin, and the world would witness the opening shots of a revolution that would forever change history. The events of Lexington and Concord changed the conflict forever. British soldiers who marched into Massachusetts believed they were carrying out orders and restoring control over rebellious colonists. The militia members who stood against them believed they were defending their homes and their rights. The fighting that followed became the moment when political resistance transformed into armed rebellion. Massachusetts became the spark that started the war, but the survival of the revolution depended on the contributions of all the colonies. Virginia became one of the most influential colonies because it produced many of the movement's greatest leaders, including George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Patrick Henry. Pennsylvania became the political heart of the revolution, where leaders debated independence and created the Declaration of Independence. Connecticut became a major supplier of weapons, food, and military materials, earning a reputation as an important support colony. New York became strategically critical because its location and waterways influenced the movement of armies. The revolution succeeded because different colonies contributed different strengths toward a shared goal. The people living through this era experienced uncertainty, sacrifice, and constant danger. The revolution was not only fought by famous generals and political leaders. It was carried by ordinary people whose lives were changed forever. Farmers left their land to join militias. Merchants risked their businesses by supporting resistance. Women carried the responsibility of managing households, farms, and businesses while many men were away fighting. Enslaved and free black people experienced a complicated reality as a war centered around the idea of liberty unfolded while slavery remained deeply established in American society. Connecticut also played a far more critical role in the American Revolution than it is often credited for, earning the nickname the Provision State because of its steady and reliable support for the war effort. While battles and political declarations often centered in places like Massachusetts, Virginia, and Pennsylvania, Connecticut functioned as one of the most consistent supply and manpower engines of the entire rebellion. The state provided thousands of militia soldiers who served in key campaigns under George Washington's command, including early defensive efforts in New York and later engagements throughout the Northern Theater. Beyond soldiers, Connecticut supplied food, livestock, gunpowder, cannons, and essential military equipment that helped sustain the Continental Army during some of its most difficult winters and campaigns. Its economy, though smaller than some neighboring colonies, became deeply tied to the war effort, with farms, workshops, and local industries redirected toward supporting independence. Even geographically, Connecticut's position made it strategically valuable, sitting between key colonial corridors that allowed movement of troops and communication. In many ways, while Massachusetts may have sparked the revolution and Virginia helped lead it, Connecticut helped keep it alive through endurance, production, and unwavering logistical support when resources were scarce and the future of the rebellion was far from guaranteed. Native nations were forced to make difficult decisions as they attempted to protect their lands and communities during a conflict between two powerful sides. The American Revolution was not only a war between Britain and the colonies, it was also a struggle that deeply affected the indigenous nations who had lived across these lands for generations. Many native leaders viewed the conflict through the lens of survival, diplomacy, and protecting their territories from further expansion. They understood that whichever side won the war would have a major impact on their future. Some native nations chose to support the British because they believed the Crown offered a better chance of limiting colonial expansion into their homelands. The British government had previously issued policies such as the Proclamation of 1763, which attempted to restrict colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. To many indigenous leaders, this suggested that Britain might serve as a barrier against settlers moving deeper into native territory. Other native nations chose different paths depending on their own circumstances, alliances, and relationships with nearby colonies. The Iroquois Confederacy, one of the most powerful indigenous political alliances in North America, faced internal divisions over how to respond. The 6 nations of the Haudenosaunee were not united in their decision, and different groups made separate choices. The Mohawk leader Joseph Brant became one of the most prominent indigenous allies of the British, believing that cooperation with Britain was necessary to defend Mohawk lands and political influence. Meanwhile, other native communities attempted to remain neutral, hoping to avoid destruction from a war that was not originally their own. However, neutrality became increasingly difficult as both sides sought alliances, supplies, and military support. The revolution created a new nation, but it also exposed contradictions that would continue for generations. The promise of freedom inspired many, while others continued to fight for the rights that were still denied to them. The American Revolution was ultimately a battle over identity, power, and the future of government itself. The British soldiers who marched through colonial towns believed they were defending the authority of the crown and preserving order throughout the empire. The patriots who resisted them believed they were fighting against unfair control and defending the right of people to govern themselves. Between these two sides were millions of ordinary people forced to make choices during one of history's greatest transformations. The spies who carried secret messages, the writers who warned communities, the soldiers who fought on battlefields, and the families who endured hardship all contributed to the creation of a new nation. The conclusion of the American Revolution marked the birth of something the world had never seen before, a new nation built from rebellion, sacrifice, and the belief that people could shape their own destiny. After years of hardship, countless battles, and the sacrifices of soldiers, families, and communities, the United States emerged from the conflict no longer as a collection of colonies, but as an independent nation. Britain, once the empire that ruled over these lands, was forced to recognize American independence through the Treaty of Paris in 1783, acknowledging the United States as a sovereign country. The victory was remarkable because the colonies had challenged one of the most powerful empires on earth and succeeded against overwhelming odds. Yet the true measure of the achievement was not only defeating an enemy, but creating a vision for a new society. The founders understood that independence was not the end of the struggle, but the beginning of a greater responsibility. The young nation faced challenges ahead, but it carried with it the determination, courage, and resilience that had carried it through war. From the fields of Lexington and Concord to the final victories that secured independence, America's Revolution became a symbol of perseverance and the pursuit of self-government. A new chapter had begun, and the hope of a rising nation rested on the belief that through unity, sacrifice, and courage, a people could build a future unlike anything the world had known before. The revolution was not created by one battle or one person. It was built through years of tension, sacrifice, resistance, and the belief that a different future was possible. From the streets of Boston to the battlefields across the colonies, the struggle for independence became one of the most important turning points in world history. If you enjoyed this journey through the American Revolution, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more stories from the battles, leaders, and events that shaped the United States. Like and subscribe for more.